Has anyone here seen the 2014 film Whiplash? Okay, a couple of people have. All right. It stars the actor Miles Teller as a jazz student at a New York conservatory. He aspires to play the drums and comes to study with a teacher who is played by the actor J.K. Simmons. This teacher is known to be an eccentric genius, and he has dozens of students who try to impress him with their playing. In one of the opening scenes, we see a full jazz ensemble in an old building with peeling plaster and risers for the students to perform on. Simmons' character stands in front of them and strikes up the band. The horns come in, the bass thumps, and the piano strikes up its notes. And then suddenly he brings everything to a screeching halt. The teacher looks at one of the students and tells him that his timing is off. They start playing again, and then it seems like in no time he stops them, cuts them off, and just like that, he throws the student out of his class for good. The film progresses through the school year with the jazz instructor asserting more and more demands upon his students, and the music room keeps getting smaller and smaller. Miles Teller's character becomes the target for this instructor. He gets thrown out for having his timing be off as well, but then he keeps showing up in order to be let back in, and his persistence does indeed get him let back into the band. He's then made to practice for hours and hours with no break. The teacher starts to look not only demanding, but perhaps somewhat unstable, maybe even a little bit sadistic. In the scene from the film that I cannot forget, the student is made to play a 5-second loop of music on the drums again and again and again while the teacher insults his skills. And when he gets up from the drums, finally hours have elapsed. The camera pans to his hands, which are covered in blood from the force of his playing. At that point in the film, the student has given up his friends, his love interests, has stopped seeing his family, even stopped working on other academic projects. He sacrifices everything for the music. It is an unsettling film to watch, in part because of the visceral imagery, and in part, for me, because I went to an arts school. I luckily did not study music there, and I had a pretty easygoing time of it in the creative writing program, I admit. I just spent a lot of hours reading books I probably would have read anyway and getting to write bits of poetry here and there. But I do remember some of the actors and the musicians in that school having a full day of classes that started at 8 a.m. And then after class let out at 4 p.m., those same students would stay and rehearse until 8, 9, or even 10 p.m. This was not uncommon. I wondered how they did it, with both a mix of admiration and repulsion. I wondered at the time how a life like that could not become terribly imbalanced. Where was the time for enjoyment, or friends, or reflection, or relaxation? It does seem intuitively right that when someone exhibits such a singularity of focus on one part of their lives, that things in other parts become neglected. One child psychologist wrote about her experience with a client, saying, "I recently sat with a 10-year-old who was only getting 5 hours of sleep at night. It turned out that after a day at a highly competitive, demanding school, this child went first to soccer practice and then to additional private courses in any number of different subjects, language, art, music, or high-level math. His anxiety had become so high about performing in these different areas that he would often stay up working and worrying late into the night. The psychologist continues, "No wonder this 10-year-old wasn't sleeping. I wondered when he even managed to eat, let alone have any time to explore his own inner world." Now, I wish that his story was some kind of outlier, something unfamiliar to all of us. But more and more, it sounds just like it's preparation for the demands of adult life. In our contemporary globalized culture, such demanding schedules have become the new normal. I saw a documentary not long ago about parts of Asia where companies expect their workers to routinely put in 12 or 14-hour days. A new market has started to capitalize off of this, creating what they call microbeds that can be pulled out of an office wall so that a worker can get 10 minutes of sleep here and there and then get up and work even harder. Or they can stay the night and start working first thing in the morning the next day. Americans are little better, enjoying less leisure time than they have at any other part of our history. When that level of demand becomes the cultural expectation, whether it's here or abroad, it is no wonder that finding balance has simultaneously become a cultural concern. That should be no surprise. We are constantly trying to balance life's seesaw, but rarely finding that point of equilibrium. And if you need evidence of this, there are mountains of books on balance. Indeed, they line the shelves of any self-help section. A Google search of how to find balance in your life brings up 332 million results. It is also one of the most frequently written about topics in the magazine Psychology Today, with dozens of articles coming up in a search. Now, it may sound like the direction that I'm heading in this sermon is that if we just had a little bit more leisure time, then we Americans, or we overcommitted children, or we globalized citizens will find balance. But I am not sure that that is necessarily the case for reasons I'd like to explore this morning. Overwork can be driven by exigency for sure. I would not deny that. Oftentimes, people work a second or even third job in order to make ends meet. But sometimes overwork is driven as much by habit. It becomes as much a way of life as it becomes a necessity. There can be something almost pleasurable about imbalance, about excess, about overdoing it in this area. And that, I think, is a spiritual malady as much as it is a problem of circumstance. I certainly think that the 10-year-old who gets 5 hours of sleep a night fits into that category, as does his parents. He's certainly not doing that because he needs to earn a better living. What's the point of doing that, really? That's the question. And taking more time off will not necessarily fix that, I would say. Instead, what is required here, what is required when work becomes a value for work's sake alone, is a deeper understanding of what our spiritual values are and why we value them. Now, religions have long reflected on the meaning of balance in one's life. The Buddha advocated a middle way, which was a key part of his journey towards the Enlightenment. You may remember that he spent years in the woods, eating nothing but a single grain of rice each day, starving himself and torturing his body. But he gave this up. He ultimately endorsed a program neither of rigid asceticism nor of attachment to worldly objects. It was in finding balance that one would find freedom, he said. Jesus, too, is seen as endorsing a middle way of compromise, especially when it came to paying taxes or working on the Sabbath or socializing and eating with people deemed undesirable. And Taoism often speaks of the need for balance as well. The Tao is a life-giving force that expresses itself when we become not occupied with the extremes of life, but rather in that in-between space where we find balance. Yet another ancient philosophy that helps me to understand balance is in one's life is a system of understanding personalities that developed in the ancient Far East. It has gotten increasing attention from psychologists in the last decades who have begun to view it as a useful tool. It's called the Enneagram, which is a set of 9 personality traits. Has anybody heard of the Enneagram? Does anybody know what their Enneagram personality trait is? Okay, a couple people do. Now, if you are interested in the Enneagram after this sermon, you can take tests to find out what type you are simply by going online. There's lots of them. And a lot of times people just read the different personality types and then know which one they are right away. That was me, actually. So what are these types? Well, one example of an Enneagram personality type is the carer. And that person is motivated by ensuring the well-being of others. Another type is the artist, who's motivated by creative expression. And then there's the Epicurean, who values experiences, and it values experiencing life deeply. And then there's the reformer, who's motivated to change the world for the better. This system, as I interpret it, is not necessarily about identifying our strengths. And that's one of the things that people do with the Enneagram. They think that, this kind of identifies what my strengths are. And that's not necessarily the case. Instead, I look at the Enneagram as more about finding our unique tendencies towards imbalance. Let me explain. If my Enneagram personality trait is the carer, it means that I'm being healthy when I am balancing my innate capacity and desire to care with my own life goals and dreams and needs. The tendency of that personality type is to overdo it and give oneself away completely in the service of others. So if a person is a carer, he or she needs to be particularly cautious so as not to become imbalanced by giving away too much. The same is true of the reformer. If my personality is that of the reformer, then I am in balance when I'm able to change some things about life while also allowing other things in life to be as they are. But I am out of balance as a reformer when I see everything as a problem that I need to fix personally. I'm probably driving away the people who are near to me by trying to change them, and I'm also spinning my wheels on issues that I have no hope of making a difference about. And here is where I think the rubber hits the road in terms of our cultural imbalances, the ones that I talked a little bit about earlier. I've actually started to wonder if certain cultures don't exhibit Enneagram traits. Specifically, the personality that has a tendency to overdo it in terms of work is called the achiever. And that person is out of balance when they are working 14 hours a day and not developing relationships or spending time on other pursuits. Now, I've not read of anyone who has written about the Enneagram from a cultural perspective. I wouldn't be surprised if someone else has noticed this just like me, but I haven't seen that. But it would seem that our culture, if it had an Enneagram trait, it would be that of the achiever, and it would be pretty far out of balance. And the way to balance that is not necessarily to give everybody more leisure time, Because someone who is out of balance as an achiever in the Enneagram, if you give them more free time, what are they going to fill it with? More work. They're going to fill it with more work. The solution is rather to engage in introspective spiritual reflection, which allows one to shift their habits and their worldviews. I would suggest that starts small, that it is slowly and intentionally finding joy in the moments that pull us closer to balance and pull us away from the things that imbalance us. Perhaps that is spending more time with family, or making time to read and write, or taking up a spiritual practice. All of those bring us a little bit closer to the joy of balance. I feel mixed about the ending of the film Whiplash. And I'll try not to give away too much if you want to add this movie to your watch list on Amazon or Netflix. But essentially, there are two endings in this film. There's a final ending, and then there's also a penultimate ending, an earlier ending. The final ending was artistically satisfying, but I also thought that it was problematic for all of the reasons that I've already spoken about in this sermon, and I won't say any more about it than that. But it is the first ending that I appreciated from a spiritual perspective. In that ending, after he had endured the humiliation and the broken relationships and the bloody hands because of his abusive teacher, the Miles Teller character walks away. He starts to reconnect with the friendships that he had lost. He reaches out to the love interest that he had rejected. He asks for support from his family. He even reports the abuse that he has suffered to his school so that other students do not have to undergo what he endured. It is the story of moving from a painful and narrow life to one that is closer to wholeness, moving from imbalance a little bit closer to balance. And there is something in that, I think, some kind of prescription for how we might live. It is in that kind of balance that we can, I think, begin to redeem our lives and then have enough left over to make the world a little bit better. My spiritual companions, may it be so. Amen. I love you, and blessed be.